Okay. Welcome everyone to today's launch event. I'm Iman Siddiqui. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor here at VoxDev, and we're super excited to be joined by the senior editors of our new VoxDevLit on political polarization. Cesi Cruz is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Economics at the University of Michigan. Horacio Larreguy is an Associate Professor of Economics and Political Science at ITAM in Mexico City. In today's sessions, we're going to hear from our senior editors about the key takeaways from policy from the review of research on the causes and consequences of political polarization. If you have any questions throughout, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to post them. There you can also vote on other people's questions if you'd like to see those answered. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ceci.
Hi everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm here with my good friend Horacio, and we're presenting results from our recent VoxDevLit. Go ahead, Horacio. So we often think about polarization as a problem of politics, and of course it is. We think about it as something that happens in Washington or Westminster, but it's actually a development challenge too, right? Because polarization can reduce trust in government, and institutions. It really distorts the information environment and can even affect how citizens view issues, how they interpret facts, or evaluate actions. And this is even more important in this context, and that's why you all are here today with us, because in low and medium income countries, polarization actually hits harder. If you think about it in these contexts, these countries have weaker institutions. They tend to have more fragmented media systems, and perhaps most troublingly, the fact that often these kinds of political cleavages and political divisions overlap with existing social divisions, and that can magnify all of these effects. And so we're here to discuss polarization because it's not just about gridlock or sort of an inefficiency in the way that we make policies, because this is a context where even neutral development policies, even neutral interventions that we're trying to do that in our minds have nothing to do with politics, can be interpreted in partisan ways or leveraged for partisan gain. And so, we're trying to think about, how do we make development policy in places where politicians are often incentivized to, beat their their opponents, right? Or win the contest or win the election rather than to solve real development problems. And just so and because of this, we essentially have situations where polarization can reshape who citizens trust, how elites behave, and what their incentives are to make policies, and even how those policies are evaluated. Next slide, Horacio, please. And this is not just a theoretical concern or problem. It's something that we actually see across the globe. And this chart was put together by Horacio and his co-authors that shows using VDEM data to show rising polarization across different regions. And so what you can see from this chart that it's not an isolated trend, right? Even if most of the news we hear about polarization might be coming from closer to home for many of us, it's something that's happening across the globe. And what you can see also is that the trajectories might be different and the starting points certainly are different. But the overall direction is often the same, and especially in the kinds of areas where democratic institutions are young or politics is more contested, which is precisely the types of environments that, as development professionals and policymakers and academics, these are the types of environments that we work in. Next slide, please. We frame the causes of political polarization here and in our lit into four main categories, right? We talk about structural ones, elite-driven polarization, informational causes, and psychological causes. But the thing is that they all of these different things interact. So you can imagine an elite incentive exploiting identity divisions or emotional content that might spread faster because of the platform design. We just separate them out here to make it easier to map onto the interventions that we're going to be discussed shortly. So the next few slides walk through these one by one. So polarization often reflects these much deeper social cleavages, as I've alluded to earlier. And this is especially the case in much of the developing world, where what you're really seeing is an echo of these ethnic, religious, regional, or even class lines. And when these identity cleavages map onto competition or party affiliations, it can reinforce and entrench polarization. We also see this happening when people feel excluded economically or socially. It can fuel demand for this type of anti-elite or populist movements, would often go hand in hand with affective polarization because these movements tend to cast politics as sort of an us versus them, right? So they're very compatible and correspond with polarization. Next one, please, Horacio. The second cause is or bundle of causes are the idea of institutions and elites, right? You can imagine that elite incentives can fuel polarization. And in weakly institutionalized settings, we see this quite a bit where elites will use polarizing rhetoric to mobilize support or delegitimize opponents, even to distract from policy failures or performance failures. We also see polarized electorates in the developing world that sometimes reward antagonism, right, or even penalize moderation, right? We'll see content that's meant to polarize go viral or spread, whereas ones where we're trying to get people to be more moderate might not be as 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 popular. And because voters reward that antagonism, then it creates these incentives to further polarize once it's there. We also see that institutional weakness can enable this type of manipulation. You can, systems where checks and balances are fragile or where there are no norms for restraint at government can reduce the costs of using these types of strategies to polarize. We also see sometimes, and even what seems like boring electoral rules can contribute to polarization through more winner take all type of rules, where you get to a place where political parties view politics as zero sum. So I'm going to hand it over to Horacio for the next two causes of polarization, and then I will talk to you again shortly.
Thanks, Cesi. Yeah, so the fourth set of causes that sort of like Ceci alluded to is sort of the rise of the internet and social media. Sort of in this sort of review piece that Ceci mentioned before that I had with Pierre Raffler. So we show essentially that this sort of previous plot that you saw of this trending sort of increase sort of in polarization across the globe goes hands in hand actually with an increase in sort of internet use and social media sort of use sort of across the globe. And there are sort of a set of both quasi-experimental sort of observational type set of work and also experimental pieces, but also more general work that points out at the importance of the internet and social media for these dynamics. When it comes to experimental work, sort of actually we can see that throughout the globe. I mean, importantly, like something that I Cecilia didn't mention, but I think it's something we need to acknowledge is that unfortunately a lot of the literature we're going to be discussing is not coming from the developing world, and so one of the things that I want to get to at the very end is that we need much more work to kind of in the developing world, but we do think that everything we're presenting here does translate to the context sort of what we're interested in. So going back to what I was mentioning, sort of like there's a lot of quasi-experimental work showing how like mobile internet access sort of is associated with increased affective and ideological polarization and support for sort of extreme and sort of anti-establishment parties. There's a very nice paper by Guriev that shows sort of in the European context that because of the increasing levels in internet access has actually drive a lot of what we see as this extreme vote this vote for extreme kind of right-wing candidates. We have comparable evidence sort of from Latin America. You can sort of think of the Brazilian case as well. And importantly, like it's not just a story of like just internet and social media provide you with information that is creating the polarization, although that's the case. And for example, Guriev shows that a lot of this effect is driven by increased discontent with incumbents because people now learn about corruption scandals and sort of like poor performance that before traditional media was slightly slightly more co-opted, and it was harder for them to sort of access that type of information. But also importantly, it's not just the information, but also how social media and the internet sort of presents this type of information. I'll get back to this more later on, but essentially, usually, this is much more emotionally charged content than traditional media. And as I'll discuss later, this really affects how information is sort of processed. So first, received, and secondly, processed, and sort of and the likelihood essentially that people might sort of update or not, their beliefs, and sort of and act consequently as a function of whether things align to with the views of the world or not. When turning to the experimental evidence, the evidence is a bit more mixed. In the sort of the more sort of like a developed context, and but essentially, and importantly, it really varies sort of by sense of whether initially you have basically like low levels of polarization or high levels of polarization. In more moderate settings, experiments are sort of like interventions that basically try to deactivate people from social media. It has been done with like undergrad students at Stanford, or sort of a very nice paper by Levy that actually sort of enrolls people on back then sort of Facebook to basically like follow sort of cross partisan medias. Actually, that seems to be sort of showing that indeed social media is an important contributor to the rise of polarization. More recent studies in much more like polarized contexts actually show very limited effects of deactivation. So experiments, essentially you pay people just not to consume social media for a month, or algorithm manipulation that basically tries to kind of reduce this sort of bias exposure to like more pro-attitudinal type news, and sort of putting kind of both the previous sort of work and this work. What seems to be going on is that the internet, social media really contributes to increased polarizations in early stages. But once you're essentially too polarized, possibly thanks to social media and the internet, it's kind of, if I deactivate you, take you away from those dynamics, it's a bit too late, essentially in that margin. And this is quite important when interpreting sort of the evidence out there, especially because social media platforms do have an incentive now to try to provide like more recent evidence that they're not part of the cause. But so it's important to kind of like see like that we're talking about very different contexts, kind of early stages versus how things are nowadays. And more broadly, essentially, there are many theoretical reasons for us to sort of realize how is that the internet and social media are contributing to polarization, and this is mostly through what we might have heard as sort of like echo chambers and filter bubbles, which kind of contributes to polarization. First, so pretty basic sort of, and this is no news to anyone. Sort of, people are disproportionately exposed to like-minded content across pretty much any sort of social media platform, calling Meta, Twitter, Reddit, Gap. So we have like lots of evidence pointing that out. And so you might wonder, well, but this is because now people are on social media. If they were offline, sort of that they would be exposed to similarly sort of like-minded content. That's not the case. Essentially, we have evidence that people are much more ideologically sorted online than offline. Sort of, I mean, like usually, like most likely the person you basically interact with, in the market, in an offline setup, basically it might actually not necessarily have the same sort of ideological alignment. Unfortunately, we have stopped talking to those folks, and we mostly basically like spend countless hours sort of on social media. And also importantly, sort of the internet and social media really facilitates sort of selective consumption of information. Now it's much easier and sort of like to really like focus on specific pieces of news that basically that are catered to our priors, as opposed to, for example, like just buying a traditional newspaper and just having to read everything in paper, right? Sort of in a way where it's a lot harder to sort out kind of what type of news you might want to consume or not, as opposed to what we can do kind of nowadays. And that has really shaped also the incentives of different, both traditional outlets, but also like more online outlets, in terms of which type of pieces of news to basically target to people. And essentially, we do know that people like reading like-minded content, and therefore that's kind of like different outlets specialize in sort of in targeting certain ideological sort of citizens. And also, like going back to what I said before, this is not just about information. The nature of the environment, internet more broadly, but in particular social media, it's really good at sort of amplifying the dissemination of emotionally charged content, and people are much more likely to basically really click on things that we have amazing evidence on this that really like made them like react, have this gut feeling, both pro and sort of and against, and that's, as I'll show later, is going to affect not just what they consume, but also how they're going to process so that type of information. And we have evidence pointing out that, and Cesi and I have previous work on this in the context of misinformation that really helps sort of misinformation diffusion and people sort of like sort of buying that type of those type of news. So then the last sort of in terms of like drivers of polarization, which is I was like just talking about before, and importantly, as Ceci said, like really like these are not like really separate, isolated things. They really sort of interact with each other. Is the issue of sort of like of psychological sort of and emotional drivers, and sort of which we think is quite important. Political messages, both like kind of, hidden sort of in between news, but also from elites who are basically trying to mobilize voters by polarizing. So it generates a lot of like strong emotions and sort of like create a sort of captivated attention and actually sort of increase political engagement. We have like very good evidence that increases polarizing messages are very mobilizing, and it's going to really also like I'll also discuss more later, reshape sort of attitudes and sort of and contribute to reinforce polarization. And importantly, this is not just an ideological level, but also it's at an affective level. People now sort of have these sort of emotions towards the other side. They're less willing to engage with them, and I'm going to reduce the extent to which they're open to new ideas or even discussing to people sort of across the aisle, as we used to. So now turning so far basically we have covered these like four main sets of drivers, and again we want to emphasize that they're not they don't operate in isolation. We just need to find a way to kind of dissect the corp and but now essentially like we're turning to like what are the sort of consequences of polarization, to then later on try to figure out, okay, what are the given these drivers and given these consequences, how basically what are the type of interventions that are tackling these different mechanisms to kind of counter polarization. So at the high level, essentially polarization will disrupt both kind of the behavioral and sort of institutional foundations of democratic governance. As I wrote, sort of like and this can be split again into three kind of core areas. One is basically just democratic backsliding. How they contribute to the erosion of the norms and institutions that basically have held to democracy, constraining sort of politicians and so on, safeguarding pluralism. The second set of things is sort of the accountability and governance by sorting how people consume and process information and evaluate leaders and react consequently to new evidence. It's going to really shape and undermine. So I'm going to show you later, accountability. And lastly, essentially, this has also just important macroeconomic consequences. It's going to increase political uncertainty, economic stability, a subsequent investment, and sort of long-run development. And sort of we're going to briefly cover that as well. I want to but mostly focus on the first two, particularly in the middle one. So, as I was saying, sort of polarization can really erode the basic norms of democracy, like just tolerating each other, allowing people to like sort of to have like different opinions in an amicable way. And very importantly, and something that's going to keep coming, is the issue of respecting sort of institutional constraints that might not go the way we want, which are basically at the core of what we understand is it's like a well-functioning sort of democracy. Essentially, what we have on the water level, lots of evidence that unfortunately voters now perceive as, because highly polarized voters perceive the other side as these existential threats, and therefore they're willing to forgo attacks by sort of anti-democratic candidates, populist candidates, sort of to those core sort of democratic institutions, because these are portrayed by these elites a bit like what Ceci was mentioning before, as a way to basically like safeguarding sort of their sort of interest and obviously like now they hate the other side and they're okay with that. What's even more concerning though is actually oftentimes there's an electoral return for so anti-democratic candidates like of doing this type of things, right? So in a way, it's not necessarily mean, but oftentimes candidates kind of run on with platforms of sort of undermining sort of democratic governance, and now actually that seems to have sort of political support. So you have this really like bad dynamic, or sort of like now voters are being okay with this, and also candidates having incentives to sort of like to undermine democratic institutions, because obviously this helps them to stay in power. And I'm going to show some evidence later that points to that. So if you just want coarse figures, you can take the initial plot by Cesi and just aggregate this globally, weighting by population or not. This is weighted by population. You can see the exact same feature. And look at essentially both sort of like political polarization, this is what Cesi showed before, but also you can look at social polarization, which is a proxy of affective polarization from BM. And pretty much you see a very important jump across the globe starting basically the last sort of 15 years. And what you see coincidentally and sort of and very worryingly in parallel is basically a reduction in the perceived sort of like extent of how democracies sort of are liberal. And this policy, which is just focusing on actual democracies, we're excluding sort of autocracies in this plot. So I think this is a very powerful picture and sort of in terms of showing how this polarization and sort of democratic backsliding go hand in hand beyond any other like cherry-picked example that we all might have, unfortunately, in mind. Now, turning to issues of accountability and governance, as I preview, polarization really affects essentially how people are gonna consume, process, and sort of interpret and react to information about sort of incumbent performance. As I mentioned, basically polarized citizens are sort of are much less likely to be able to actually to consume sort of information that may not fit their view of the world, and so they're going to try to avoid things. You might have just for the case everybody knows, a Democrat trying not to consume sort of like avoiding Fox News, and sort of Republicans sort of avoiding CNN. We have increasing evidence throughout the globe that that's the case. And also, that said, oftentimes, voters do get exposed to sort of counter-attitudinal information, things that don't fit their view of the world. And what the problem, though, essentially is that when they do, and they're heavily polarized, they're less likely to actually like internalize this type of information. I won't get much into the details, but this could be for behavioral or more like even like rational reasons. But essentially, we do have sort of many theoretical reasons and some empirical evidence that points out that people are less likely to incorporate these beliefs. That means essentially if you have like a voter who basically supports an incumbent and finds out sort of information about malpractices, corruption, or just basic sort of poor sort of performance along certain policy dimensions, they're going to be less likely to internalize this. And this is like a general thing. In more extreme cases, and more concerningly, and unfortunately, I'm going to show you some very compelling evidence about this, is that we might happen that actually information generates what we call like backfiring or a backlash. And essentially, what's end up happening is that they went back to a particular sort of voter that supports an incumbent and finds out the negative sort of performance information, they might think, oh, actually, like, no, they're trying to attack my candidate because it's great, and this is kind of the only way opposition, like can get at my candidate. And actually think that, even that better about the candidate after being exposed to information that actually suggested that, that was a poor sort of performing incumbent. And so at the end of the day, like information that should have persuaded people, like pure rational people, that, essentially the incumbent probably is not as good as they thought, actually backfires and strengthens the beliefs that this was actually a good candidate. And we have sort of, unfortunately, several cases of evidence that these sort of theoretical possibilities are actually sort of reality, both and mostly sort of this is in the context of development interventions, where you try to approach voters and provide them with like novel information that otherwise will not consume. And I'm going to talk about a specific intervention that I conducted sort of ahead of the 2021 municipal elections in Mexico, where actually like it was Mexico's extremely polarized context. COVID was also a very polarizing issue. So essentially, like we team up with a CSO that wanted to provide information about sort of incumbent sort of performance in terms of like the relative performance within state in terms of COVID cases and deaths. And broadly, essentially, sort of what we find is that if you provide basic information, and so far I'm going to talk about just the baseline treatment where we just provide information. We actually do have a solution. I'm going to talk about our potential solution. I'm going to discuss later when talking about like how to counter polarization. But essentially, if you just provide sort of basic information, it actually sort of backfires. So let me show you this. So essentially, the way it worked out is a voter. This is an experiment done basically in a fifth of municipalities in Mexico, and sort of we are roughly sort of have 500 municipalities sort of in our sample, and sort of so a voter, a citizen on Meta will essentially see some sort of screen that points out, hey, do you want to know about the performance of your incumbent. There was some basic information, and then some people would also see the policies they implemented to try to sort of target COVID. But most importantly, what you care about right now is that we show this type of information to voters, which essentially we tell them how they rank within the state. And pretty much it could be like in the sort of intermediate tier side, like the municipality within the state that have like most cases, intermediate level of cases, or the lowest tier, so the fewest number of cases. So it's very, very simple information. We piloted this a lot, so you cannot provide numbers to people. You just need to know, like, you're among the boards, you are, like among the best, or just like somewhere sort of in between. And we do this both for cases and for this. So it's very easy to interpret information. And then what we do, and important, this is not just a survey, this is really focusing on polling station level data, is that we can compare essentially voters who got this information against a control group that randomly was chosen not to receive this type of information. We're focusing on polling station level data. And then we can look at essentially the difference in the vote share of voters that got the information versus not, depending on where the municipality is kind of in the upper tercile, the worst performing cases, the best performing cases, or intermediate level cases. Essentially, what you see over here, this is for cases on the left and for deaths sort of on the right, is the exact opposite that you would expect. What you see is that poor performing candidates, essentially candidates who were among ranking the worst in terms of number of COVID cases and deaths, and sort of are actually rewarded roughly between 3 and 5 percentage points at the polling booth. And the worst performing people actually are not actually marginally punished, although they actually potentially exerted exhibited a good performance. So this points out essentially how, like contrary to what we information was doing in Mexico, which, and I have a lot of work on that. So people used to be like quite rational before, things became much more polarized. And now polarization really essentially undermines the basic of accountability, which is like, if I give information about incumbent performance, you should react sort of accordingly. Then lastly, in terms of sort of consequences, the of polarization, essentially what we have is that, because of how it reshapes the policy making process, essentially this much greater increase in sort of political uncertainty and economic stability. This is just comes from sort of the elite playground, in Congress, and just basically like you shift people, and so they don't talk to each other, and so there's a swing in policy. But also importantly, it also shapes citizen level sort of attitudes toward macroeconomic figures. So we have this very nice paper by Cobian and co-authors, essentially points out that now, depending on whether who is in power sort of is aligned or not with your views, you have very, very different expectations about inflation, unemployment, and the extent to which economic growth. And this sort of what we call the animal sentiments are very, very important for subsequent investment decisions. And this is essentially what Asimonti shows, that if you look at polarization in the media, you correlate that with investments, there's a strong sort of sort of negative correlation, which we might not see in terms of short-term developmental outcomes, but certainly this does affect long-term growth. So let's see what happens ahead. Now, turning to interventions of counter polarization, I'm going to hand over the baton to Cesi for a little bit, and then I'll close it.
Thanks, Horacio. And so now that we know all of the bad things that can happen because of polarization, we want to talk about what the solutions are. And here, what I want to highlight is that we need more research, right? We need more evidence on a lot of these things. We've broken down the interventions again, just because the causes are multidimensional. So are the interventions. We group them into these 5 categories, from social contact all the way to platform reform. And while each of them works differently, depending on the context and the medium and the mechanisms, it really means that we need to be choosing these levers correctly. We also highlight the fact that, again, just like when we were talking about the causes of polarization being interrelated, many of these interventions also work well together, right? They also complement each other, or some might work better with others as well. And so we'll go through them in turn. Next slide, please. Next slide, Horacio. Thanks. So one promising path, and actually this is one of the ones where we probably have the most evidence on, are these social contact and dialogue interventions. And what this means is essentially just this sort of structured contact and interactions across groups that are polarized. And so this can take a number of different forms. It can be things like community dialogues or cross-partisan workshops or even sort of standard perspective-taking exercises, which will then relate quite a bit to psychological interventions that Horacio will be talking about later on. And the idea with these types of interventions is that you want to foster empathy or shared identity or an openness, right, to the other group. And this is what really deals with affective polarization, right? So this is not necessarily about policies or, getting people to agree with each other on policies, but more about getting people to understand, getting people to sort of see the perspective of the other group. And in the developing world, the evidence base is still growing, but results from programs that are focused on the context, are sort of rooted in the context and build trust and shared identity are really encouraging. Here, I want to especially mention work by my colleague Salma Musa, who's been really instrumental in testing a lot of these social contact interventions in especially difficult political settings, right? And like I said, it's sort of limited evidence, but promising where results show that there are some lasting improvements in trust, as well as reduced prejudice and bias following these types of interventions. Thanks, Horacio. Next slide. Elite-driven and institutional intervention. So these next two categories are where most of my own work are in. And the rationale for these types of interventions is the fact that polarization often starts at the top, right? Like you can, or reinforced at least, right, by elite cues, or even things like institutional rules and institutional reforms. Because elites shape how divided or comparative the political discourse is, at least the ones that are coming from them, their rhetoric or strategies can either escalate or diffuse polarization. So, for example, there's a lot of evidence that bipartisan messaging, right, or campaign moderation can help, but it does have to be the sort of credible and sustained type of messaging. Effects otherwise tend to fade unless they're somehow repeated or unless they're coming from these sort of credible sources. So, for example, there's some work from the US that looks at bipartisan campaign messaging. And in terms of the again, like in much of these interventions, as Horacio mentioned, this is probably one of the least tested areas in low and middle income countries, and evidence is thin, especially if we think about the sort of experimental evidence that Horacio had described in this previous section. Most of those studies come from high income democracies, especially everything on campaign messaging, and so there's big evidence gap around these elite driven interventions in developing country contexts. So one example we have is work that I've done with co-authors on nonpartisan campaign messaging, right? The idea that if your opponent is campaigning in these very polarizing ways, can you use policy messaging to sort of to counter it, right? And so we worked with a major opposition political party in the Philippines to test to randomize the content of their door-to-door campaigns to test whether we can get, can we even get people that are polarized to learn about the other group? Can we get them to be open to the other group? And we're finding some very promising results, both with testing campaign messaging directly from the party, as well as testing other forms of nonpartisan messaging. We also want to mention here, institutional reforms. And again, here, this is an area where it's very difficult to randomize and do these types of experiments. But there are some nice observational studies that look at how institutional reforms can create more incentives for moderation in these sort of more structured ways. Next slide, please, Horacio. The next slide here is on the information environment and traditional media. And while we spend most of our time here in this presentation talking about social media, of course, because this is the sort of the rising and changing, quickly changing trends that we need to adapt to. Traditional media and the information environment also matter quite a bit, right? And so this class of interventions is essentially an attempt to to improve the way that people receive and evaluate political information. Excuse me. And this is especially important in contexts where misinformation spreads rapidly, media trust is low. And so the key strategies in this category include corrections and fact checking, attempts to expose people to balanced or cross-cutting news, excuse me, and elevated trusted local media. The bad news is that we find quite a bit of that effectiveness is limited for many of these types of interventions. Fact checks, for example, alone have really mixed effectiveness. In fact, as Horacio mentioned, sometimes you can get things like backlash, right? Where people double down, after being shown the correct information, they're even more, convinced that their side is right and the other side is wrong. And so what I want to emphasize here with this class of interventions is, ways that we can pair or complement them with some of the interventions and features that Horacio is going to be talking about shortly on, psychological and cognitive ones to see whether we can combine, these types of things, because often in these really polarized contexts, what's said, the content matters less than who says it and how it's framed, right? And how trusted those messengers are. And so, especially when when polarization is already high, you can imagine that even things that seem like neutral facts, right, like government data can be interpreted through these very partisan lenses. Um, and uh, and even the corrective information, like I said, we'll talk a little bit about how the psychological and cognitive interventions can improve this. But you often can get backfire or backlash from this corrective information, especially when it's sort of challenging people's identity, right? Or challenging people's narratives about what they think the world is going on in the world. The other point that I want to make here is that, as just as social media is sort of magnifying a lot of the other challenges that we're seeing in polarization, this is also a particular area where AI can make this challenge more urgent, right? Large language models can sort of worsen misinformation, make it easier to create content that is misleading. It can make it easier to create or even to micro-target polarizing content. The flip side, of course, is that being the optimist that I am, AI is also a way that we can think about designing interventions to make it more solvable, right? So they're also powerful tools for addressing these types of issues when thoughtfully designed. A number of researchers and interdisciplinary teams are working on AI for content moderation, for example, and sort of improving media or supporting traditional media and the information environment through these content moderation tools. And in my research team, for example, we're actively working on some AI-based interventions to combine the traditional information interventions with the psychological and cognitive ones that Horacio will be discussing to leverage the social contact and work within people's identity and sort of reduce the backlash from these types of corrections. And these tools can adapt messaging, they can emphasize shared values, they can navigate these types of identity cues much more effectively than static fact checking, right? So I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And I will turn it over. I've been highlighting here already. You'll see that these next set of interventions are very important, and I'll hand it back to Horacio.
Wonderful, thanks, Cesi. I'll try to rush up a little bit. We're running out of time. So essentially, like so Cesi was previewing, like and also I mentioned, a big problem is how important how is the sort of polarization mediates the way people sort of interpret and evaluate information. So essentially, like a set of interventions try to really target that, and it's very important. It's very important in contrast to the first set of interventions that Cesi mentioned, that essentially try to like reduce polarization. This is not about reducing polarization, but it's really targeting how that affects information processing. So the typical sort of intervention here are nudges that try to reduce this bias, right, reasoning and sort of increase receptivity. So you want people essentially, look, you're gonna consume this information, you become and you're gonna become politicized, to be aware of this potential bias, and actually that by being aware, actually people are less likely to engage in this type of things. The other thing is basically just bluntly priming open-mindedness and sort of and in particular, for example. in the paper I showed you before, where on Facebook we're showing this type of information that we expected to people to polarize people to process in a biased way. We actually literally prime people to say, please do not react to this information emotionally or in a politicized way. And we actually do show that this reverses the backfire. I have some other subsequent work that shows that this nudge that's going to be quite impressive, as you'll see in a second, actually does so travel to other contexts. So let me jump to it. Pretty much this is what I showed you before. So in one set of ads, we added this line that basically says, please consider the following information without letting yourself carried away by emotions or partisan preference. That's it. That's the only difference between the ads. And we see a drastic difference. So when it comes to the cases of COVID, the information on COVID cases, we see that we go from this world to this world, essentially, where people like really and dramatically now start basically punishing sort of poor performance and rewarding good performance. Same thing happens with deaths. And you want to look at, if you wanted to causally get at the effect of what happens when people are polarized, you can take the difference between kind of like point by point, essentially whether like conditioning you on the information being like in a certain way you're in municipality, what happens if you get the nudge versus not. And this is the difference for cases, and this is the difference for deaths, and just dramatic. Essentially, pretty much the difference between basically being informed or not is that if 5 percentage points at the polling booth for the incumbent, whether it's bad information, good information. So it's very, very drastic effect just by including a single line. And we show essentially with this paper with Ernesto, like who's the junior editor here, is actually is that this also travels to other contexts. You get a piece of news that is like very politicized on incumbent performance. You have the nudge, you don't have the nudge. That really dramatically changes whether people update or not their views in a way that you would hope certain type of information suggests them to do. And then sort of turning to sort of like the last sets of interventions are the ones that also like target one of the core problems, which is basically social media. And again, as Cesi said, we're also optimists here. And basically the idea is that, we know this algorithm amplification that's going to work, but why don't we go ahead and actually harness this? And so there are sort of interventions with more mixed findings, sort of in kind of US type context. That is what you try to do is that you get the Levy paper I mentioned. You try to recruit people to basically follow cross-partisan outlets on social media, and then let the algorithm basically expose them organically to that. Or Bale and co-authors basically created this Twitter bot that basically like targeted sort of like left-winning or right-winning type news, or like the very creative and also resourceful experiment by David Brugman and Josh Kala, actually recruiting Fox viewers to consume CNN instead. And here essentially you have a bit of a mixed sort of evidence in this particular context. Fortunately for us, the evidence, although we don't have as much evidence, the evidence in sort of in developing context, and in particularly the context of the non-democracy, Turkey is much more promising. I don't have time. I'm totally running out of time, and I don't want to take Ceci's time. But pretty much, I'm happy to get back to this in the Q&A. But something that we show in this beautiful plot is that although ideologically, so this information kind of backfires, sort of like recruiting people to follow cross-party news backfires in the short term. Actually, after a while, like it's very, very persuasive. The flip side is for affective polarization, you have a short-term reduction in affective polarization that does not basically persist. And I'm happy to get into this. Happy to share also the paper if you're interested in later on. But basically, so this points out that it's so quite promising in a developing context. Essentially, engaging, harnessing the algorithm for actual good and sort of and increase cross-partisan exposure, which does reduce ideological, though not affective polarization. I'll hand it over to Ceci to wrap up. You're muted, Ceci. Oh.
Sorry. So what works? I guess here we're grouping them into promising versus more mixed levers. And again, here, like what we're, social contact and identity framing, for example, you could imagine working in conjunction with other types of interventions. But there are some overall trends, and that's sometimes, the idea that one-shot corrections or forced engagements can sometimes backfire without broader consideration for the context and things. So can I have the next slide, Horacio? We'll go a little bit quicker here. So most of the evidence that we have comes from more high-income democracies or more established democracies. And then within that, we know much less about certain types of interventions as well, right? So I already mentioned the elite messaging interventions as well as institutional design approaches. But in addition to those categories of interventions, we also don't know much about long-term outcomes, right? So this is another area where we need more research and we need more evidence. And then last, the other area that I want to highlight for research and evidence is on the mechanisms, right? A lot of the reason why we often end up combining different interventions, but it's very difficult then to then pull them apart and figure out, what aspect of this intervention worked and what's driving the change in one versus another. Next slide, please, Horacio. So a couple of lessons stand out from the research, and again, this is all in the lit that we did. The first is that the need to diagnose, right? We need to identify what the specific drivers of polarization, like which of those causes is most prominent in that particular context, before designing the interventions. The other is to front load trust, right? And to think about credibility in a way that we often start thinking about information first, but who delivers the message and how trusted they are often matters more than what the context is, right? Like back to Horacio's point, where one line, right, about just prompting people to think less in political ways can make such a difference in these types of settings before even any of the content. The other is to design for persistence, right? Another pattern that we see is that we often get a lot of mixed results from the one shot or more forced or artificial types of interventions. And then the lesson that we get from the psychological and cognitive ones is like, how can we design these interventions that are consistent with people's political and social identity? Like, how can we preempt backlash? How can we lower defensiveness before we're introducing this type of context? So next slide, please. So just to wrap up, polarization isn't a problem of just politics, and it's certainly not just a problem of advanced democracies, even if it seems like most of the news about polarization is coming closer to home for us based here in North America. It's a core constraint, and especially on the way that we design interventions for developing countries. And while tools like fact checks and transparency audits are important, they won't always land, right, if people don't trust the source. So we have to build in trust and we have to build in credibility into the interventions that we do. And the fact of the matter too is that we need to think more clearly about what the interventions are and how they address the specific causes, right, for the context that we're working in, and to really think about the types of mechanisms that we're operating through when we're trying to change these behaviors. The good news, of course, is that we're seeing real promise. From elite cues and messaging to institutional reform to social contact to even new tools using, as Horacio and I talked about, using social media and AI. We can design these types of interventions that actually reduce hostility and reduce affective polarization, and improve the way that people evaluate information and improve their reasoning. But that means that we have to really match these mechanisms to the context. And so that's the work that Horacio and I are doing now, as well as the work that we feature in this VoxDevLit. So please check that out. And we'd love to hear from you, whether it's ideas, feedback, or even places where you want to test this kind of work next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cesi and Horacio. So just to jump into some questions. So the first question we have is from Lorraine Yu from the Taipei School of Economics. What if greater internet access does not unite societies through shared information, but instead deepens political divides? And why might the regions with the highest connectivity also experience the most polarization?
You want to go?
Yeah, this had Horacio all over it, so I figured I'd let him start.
So Iman, can you go again? So I was looking at the questions and sort of like and on the Q&A and I got mixed up. So like, can you point out which one again?
It's from Lorraine Yu.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Yeah, sort of yeah, so so we do know essentially that sort of internet access does data baseline. Sort of essentially that's kind of the one of the drivers. So the whole point basically it's to try to like what we're trying to point out is that that's the evidence, which is quite very well established and sort of and that's a given, right? In a way, like there are lots of people that try to point out, oh, the problem is the platforms, you know, Meta, Twitter, stuff, they should do something about it. They clearly don't have incentives. Something we couldn't get too much with Cesi into the lead review, but actually like there's great work on trying to point out actually if you try to anything you try to do, so actually it's like kind of worsens the business for this platform. So in a way, like and there are two type of people, the ones that I guess this is where we're not that optimistic. I'm like the realistic on that one, if you don't want to call it optimistic. And so we kind of just hope that they're gonna change what they do. Like in the European Union, you know, there have been a lot of like, you know, they have a much stronger regulation. That's the case, but this is very hard to implement sort of in other cases. And so essentially it is sort of the case that essentially like, you know, that's sort of a given. So kind of our approach to that is basically that's a constraint. What can we do basically to try to sort of mitigate these type of things? And unfortunately, it won't be like, you know, disconnecting people from, or fortunately, it won't be people disconnecting people from social media.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another somewhat related question from Andreas. Usually when we discuss how to solve polarization, we conclude that the solution is more person-to-person interaction, exposure to different views and opinions, and cross-partisan news. In reality, these solutions are not working. For example, we know that more proportional electoral systems force politicians and society to engage in more discussion, which usually lowers polarization. Do you see any additional structural or legal reforms that could help reduce political polarization?
So this one, I mean, this is a great question because this is the elephant in the room for a lot of the interventions is that they might be indeed one of the more effective ones, but we've got the least amount of evidence on them, precisely because they're difficult to do. For example, with IRI and USAID, we were exploring literature on or evidence on cross-party initiatives. Like, can we get political parties to talk to each other? And the biggest finding from that evidence base is the fact that there's so little interventions that are doing this. Something like 2/3 of the interventions come from 3 countries or 4 countries. So it's an area that's very understudied and certainly needs more there because you know it's sort of harder to get political parties together to do these types of things. But I agree that I think you know this is the big you know thinking about the top-down types of interventions that can be designed in. But I do think they still have to be in conjunction with the bottom-up ones that we do, right? I think these things tend to move in together, and so you know having these types of electoral rules and institutional reforms might make a big difference as well.
Just to add a small thing there, so we're trying to do something in sort of in usually the big problem is that the politicians who are polarizing are profiting electorally from that. So it's how do you make a reform, a change that is incentive compatible? And so clearly it might be very hard to do with the people at the top, but what we're trying to do is intervention in Bangladesh, like funding permitting, is actually work with the kind of the up and coming, you know, the young politicians, and sort of actually and just train them in sort of in how to actually themselves be messengers of trying to like mitigate polarization, how to like work sort of across the aisle and point out actually how they can harness that in a polarized context as sort of as a skill, you know, and sort of in order to kind of mobilize a base that by now might be a bit alienating. So that's sort of something that we think that might have promise. But again, we don't have any evidence on this, which is why we're working on it.
Great, thank you for that. I just had one more like kind of overarching question. So given that most of the research on polarization focuses on North America and Europe, and that's mostly what we see in the news, how can we translate those findings to low and middle income countries where polarization has a different face?
Ceci, I mean, I'm happy to go. So essentially, like, this is kind of what made this job pretty hard. Essentially, like, but it's kind of like kind of I guess where researchers, you know, come in. And so like this, basically, you have to really try to abstract kind of like stake the core and figure out essentially like, like, okay, like, everybody has an arm, right? Sort of, and sort of in a way, like, like, although, like it is true the dynamics are sort of quite different, depending on the context, there are common elements that we think that do travel sort of across context. And this is kind of like mostly the focus of this piece. But for example, it's true essentially that, and sort of going back to one of the comments we had earlier, so there are very specific cleavages, and this is kind of like what Cesi briefly touched on, that are to certain societies that interact very strongly with this kind of broader dynamics that we were discussing. So essentially, so the key thing is just basically that being able to abstract, try and sort of what Ceci was mentioning at the end, trying to identify which are the particular mechanisms that are at work in this particular context, and sort of and what are the type of things that basically might travel from other contexts. So hopefully, like, like in our VoxDevLit piece, actually we try to like shed some light on these, and so. But otherwise, Ceci and I, we're always very happy to discuss sort of like if the for policymakers in the room who would like to bring some of these lessons sort of across context within the we're quite well equipped after doing this piece to help with that.
And also for the VoxDevLit, Horacio mentioned it, but I just want to highlight, the fact that we split these things up into these different categories and different causes and different drivers. You can imagine just sort of matching that to your context and then thinking about the different interventions that work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think we'll end it there. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Ceci and Horacio, for your time, both putting together the VoxDevLit review and for this presentation today. I'd highly recommend people go and check out the full review. I just put a link to it in the chat, and we will also add this recording to the website shortly alongside the slides. So anyone you know that might be interested can check it out afterwards.
And seriously, please do email us if you have any. I mean, we were not able to, partly because of poor time management, mostly on my end, to feel like, to allow for more time for Q&A. But like if please send us these questions. We're happy to reply sort of like on a different channel, and sort of and engage sort of with any doubts you might have. Sort of yeah. The partly of this is basically just to kind of open up the conversation as opposed to just like keep it into 1 hour.
Okay, I guess with that we can end. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.